Hello and welcome to the Fervent Four. Did you know that only 4% of businesses ever cross the annual $1 million revenue mark? Hello, I'm Zack Miller, author of Anomaly. With me today, I'm my co-host Tim Ryan, lead man at StartWheel.org. Thank you so much for joining us. The Fervent Four is a weekly show each and every Thursday at 11 a.m. dedicated to sharing insights into growing a world-class business no matter the climate. Today, we are joined by Kala Fleming, and we are so delighted to be here with you. Hello.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so you have like a legit TED Talk, not a TEDx talk. Like it's a legit TED Talk. Like, is that was I watching the right thing? Is it a TEDx? Is it a real TED Talk? Like what?
It's a legit TED Talk. So during my IBM days, there was a period of time where there's a bit of a partnership between the TED organization and IBM, and so it's like for tech storytelling. And so there's sort of this process where, for the interesting projects across the company, we had just a period of time where, if we were selected, we would then go through that whole vetting process. So for what you see as a final TED Talk, it took, I don't know, 6 months of prep to actually deliver that whole thing.
Yeah, it was fancy. I mean, I think I saw that just from like your name website. I can't remember where I saw it, but I was like, oh, most people, are promoting that they did a TEDx talk, and I'm like, okay, that's good, And then I was like, hold on a second. This is not a TEDx talk. This is like a legit thing. Like, so mad kudos to you for that. That's exciting. I know the process can be quite, I'll use the word painful just to get there. Are you someone who speaks on stage? Was that a scary thing? Is that the biggest crowd you've ever been in? Like how did that whole thing of just like the performance aspect of it go?
Yeah, really good question. So as a researcher, scientist who tends to be, and I guess, more in my former life, but I tended to be the person who had to explain things at conferences, or to maybe business groups. But I do think as I'm now thinking back, because no one has ever asked, I think that maybe might be the largest in-person audience though that I had to deliver to. So because I had a familiarity with presenting and, tended to do a decently good job, the idea of being on stage itself, I wasn't afraid of that, or I didn't have nerves around that. Although I think every time I do go out and have a conversation in a new context or setting, there's some kind of nerves that come in. But the thought and the prospect of doing that, I was kind of jazzed about it. And then, like I said, for that prep process, you kind of had to, for the messages, even though I kind of had a sense, given what we were working on, I had a sense of what I wanted to talk about, but that first script got torn up, I don't know how many different times. And then, I think once we got to like a month or two before, then the goal was to know it cold, like fully cold.
Wow. So was it something you volunteered for, or were you selected?
It was an honor. Like it was a very selective process to be included, as a part of that. And so yeah, it was, I had a project that was, it really showcased a lot of things about the potential for the Internet of Things in emerging markets. And I guess just for context, at that point, for my journey with IBM, I was brought in as a domain expert for water. And, at that point in time, there were questions about, there's all of this stuff going on globally with AI, but they were asking the question, IBM research was, well, how can AI and other emerging technologies be useful for emerging markets, and in particular, a place like Africa? And so I was, like employee number 4 or something with a new research lab that got set up there. And so this TED Talk was maybe 2 years after that. And so it was kind of this crowning achievement of being able to at least have identified some interesting things that we were prototyping with different clients, And so for a lot of my work, because this is now looking at IoT and water innovations, and thinking about how we ultimately could use something like the Internet of Things and sensors to increase how water was flowing, I worked with, my customers, or who externally who I engage with, were like the World Banks and the USAIDs of the world. Anyway, so by the time that this came around and they were looking for projects to highlight, this was one of the examples of just a successful partnership. A successful partnership, and so it was an honor to be, selected and be a part of all of that.
So just for more context, how long was that TED Talk for our audience members
maybe?
can?
It's short. Like the actual on stage. Do you mean?
Yeah.
8 minutes. I don't think we even got to 10 because it was.
I remember looking at it being like, this is shorter, or even as I was
No. But the point that I'm trying to make for the people listening, especially with all the work that we do to try to help people with their pitch, you work 6 months on 8 minutes.
Yes, or less.
And so many founders that we run into are like, oh, I can do a pitch. I don't even need to practice. I'll just get up on stage and totally do an impromptu and just knock this thing out. And here you're telling us that you work 6 months on 8 minutes.
Yeah.
One of the most popular TED Talks is like 2.5 minutes. And it's the one where the guy has to start dancing on the field, and then he needed a follower. And then the follower was the most important. Someone had to start it. Then someone had to follow him. And then because they were dancing on this field in this random rave, then hundreds flock, and just all these randoms, dancing. And it was something about building community in that kind of case. But it's like 2.5 minutes long. And I don't know, multi-million views on something on Ted's YouTube channel or something like that. So it's pretty impressive stuff. I'm interested. We're going to get to the Frontline Gig stuff, but I'm interested in just how a TED Talk and how working for a big company, being employee number 4 or 5, like you said, at something like that, really prepared you to go out on your own and become an entrepreneur. Because I think a lot of times people don't take advantage of the situations that they're in and really leverage and capitalize that stuff to then start their own thing. It sounds like you've done a really good job of understanding that situation and then having a nice little parallel into this. But what do you think about how those things have prepared you to get on your own and do your own thing?
I really like the way that you framed that. So one of the things with my IBM journey, before that, by training, I am a civil and environmental engineer, and I do have a minor in computer science, but a lot of my work before then had been, looking at water systems, water quality, and more of the typical civil engineering, environmental engineering fare. And so with the IBM journey, then I got to, take that background and interest and think about, well, how does this all work if I put a digital tech layer on it? And so there's, all of these huge learning curves around just understanding how do you build software. And so, but how do you build software but make it relevant to deliver value, to an end user? So as far as preparation for, working in the startup world, I got a perspective or a vantage point around like what was possible and ultimately how, and ideas for how I might use technology to further the interests and the ambitions that I had around, maybe you can call it social impact, but a lot of my work tends to be like that. So I think that was the biggest piece. And I don't know if you were going to ask it next, but there are now, I think, a lot of things that are not similar. And so, like, one of the things that I think about the most, when as a truly being in the startup world, I remember that, for the lab in Kenya, it was really new. So it was in many ways like a startup. because, there's just so many things that you had to figure out, but it was a very well-funded startup. And so that kind of makes a difference in terms of,
That was IBM Kenya. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So yeah, IBM Research Africa, and maybe just for a little bit more context. So a lot of big tech companies, the way that you end up staying ahead is that you have a research group that's helping you think about what's next. So today, when I look at the landscape of technologies for what's happening, whether it's with drones or we've gotten with AI or IT, like, a lot of things we were talking about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. But it's just that now, in terms of maybe being able to connect with the market in a particular kind of way, just because there's more readiness, more maturity, just different adoption, things have changed, then you actually really see it come to life. But the strategy for staying ahead, if you're in tech, is that you've got this group of folks who are, they've got the freedom to experiment and try things and fail and try again to really line up, where might be, the next opportunity.
I want to hear more about your background. I mean, so you grew up in the Caribbean. Then you were in Kenya, and now you're in Hampton Roads. Can you share with us about your journey as far as where you started and how you ended up here?
Through a very, convoluted route, but maybe the shorthand is, so a lot of I've lived in a lot of places, so with my mom, when her friends call her, it used to be, well, where is she now? Or, like what part of the world, where is she? And so, the quest for getting an education, and then afterwards, sort of pursuing what I call dream job after dream job, that just led me to a bunch of places, but that's what guided my path. So my undergrad was in the Virgin Islands, and so I grew up in Antigua. It's like a really small island, 100,000 people, and very much under the British system. So then, for undergrad, I went to University of the Virgin Islands, and it's in the Caribbean, but because it's the USVI, it's under the US system. So that was sort of, where that journey started. And so undergrad, I was like a chemistry major. And as I thought about what I wanted to do in the future, I wanted to just get very much more applied. I didn't want to be in a chemistry lab anymore, inhaling chloroform fumes, although I guess I shouldn't say that, but that did happen. And so, and I've did stints of internships to kind of get a taste of things like chemical engineering. I was at MIT one summer, but I ultimately ended up going to the University of Wisconsin, because they were doing some cool work. There's cool work happening with water. And that was just something that I wanted to dig into more. And so, so that's how I ended up in Wisconsin to do my PhD. And then after that, as a grad student, my project was one where I was essentially managing like a small water system in a basement somewhere. And I had a bunch of undergrads who were working for me. And I thought, man, what would be really cool as like a job after, because, as a grad student, the that wage sucked. But ultimately I got my wish. And so after grad school, I went to New Jersey to work with American Water. And, and so for a couple of years, so I did water, and then I left American Water after about 4 or 5 years. That was like an amazing job. But then I wanted to kind of get a little bit better sense of the built environment. And then around that time, there's like a lot going on in sustainability. So I worked with Campbell's Soup for a bit. And then I met a friend over there who was actually from Jamaica. And she was like and she worked with Microsoft, but she was really interested in working, doing something to connect back with the young people in Jamaica. And so I helped her, get her nonprofit started. But I started to just figure out new ways to then, how do I take what I know how to do around just all of the water and environment kinds of things, but still be useful to markets beyond the US. And so that interest, then for a few years, I lived in DC and I started to do a lot more international consulting on my own. But that's then kind of what set up, sort of being in position to then head to Kenya as a next logical step in my evolution. And maybe then to kind of cut it back a little bit. And so my family had an entirely separate journey because, at some point, my parents came to the Hampton Roads area because I had other cousins who were in the military. And I don't know, for some reason with school and maybe just because of how they were placed before and after the military, like family just started to kind of come here. And so then my parents at some point, the whole green card process and citizenship, then they were like, well, we know people here. Why don't we just come here? So that's what they did while I was doing whatever else I was doing, traipsing around the world.
So did you go to high school here then?
No, high school was in Antigua. Yeah.
You got it. Okay.
So I came to know Hampton Roads because I had family here, but so last year I was actually living here, but before that it was more I was just coming in and out to say hi to family and hang out during holidays. So in terms of even understanding the business environment and all of that, that's really really in earnest that kind of started maybe late last year.
Wow.
Interesting. So a lot of people would say, wow, you've been to a tremendous amount of places. As someone who describes where you live now, where do you tell people? I think, saying Wisconsin, going, being a University of Wisconsin, my guess is Madison grad, people know where that is. When you say Hampton Roads on the map, or you say New Jersey, I think people know where that is, right? You say the Caribbean.
Virginia Beach. I think what's interesting, it's funny that I had this conversation. So I'm between Virginia Beach and Norfolk a lot at the moment, because there's like a business entity in Norfolk, but then I'm also, in Virginia Beach, both sort of living and business set up there as well. And I think because of the touristy nature of Virginia Beach, folks, I think it's a little bit more prominent to the non-military folks. So East Coast folks know Virginia Beach quite a bit. This is what I gauge.
Yeah, I feel like a moniker is not what they know, right? They know either Norfolk or Virginia Beach. So if I was in your position, I would name one of those two things, not say something else. And so it's always interesting as the world traveler, and you're way more of a world traveler than me. People know cities, not monikers. They don't know these, silly names of places, and it's I don't know where's Hampton Roads. Well, Hampton Roads is actually
that's true.
It's some body of water between Hampton and Norfolk where the two bodies meet.
I had to really look at that a couple of times to get it. Where's I agree.
It's always interesting just to see what seems to gel with other people and not. So you started a business here.
Well, how did you come up with that idea? When did you make that transformation?
Yeah, so before Frontline Gig, in addition to, I had been doing a lot of more consulting kind of work with and more international work, and so with the pandemic and a couple of other things, I just started to wonder, how do I get if I had a more stable US base, what would that look like? And so there's a pattern also, like a method to the madness of where I play. And so this idea of, moving the needle on something environmental so that citizens have better services, and having that happen through a digital platform, that's what I do all day long. It's the same version of that, no matter what you call the digital thing, whether it's AI or IoT or whatever else, it's still kind of the same, right? It's software that's doing some kind of sensing for the environment to deliver, you know, an easier way or a better way for ultimately that citizen to live their life, you know, more freely in a better way. So that's my guiding interest and motivation. But I guess one layer below that is that what I've worked on quite a bit is there's a particular kind of, you know, when you think of the infrastructure world for how do we get our services, we have these two realms. You know, there's these centralized services and then the decentralized services. So centralized services like your like drinking water, for the way that we get that, you know, multiple connected pipes, you know, have to work together and be maintained over time. But that's how we are able to open up the tap every day and the water is there. Like we never think about it. But in other places in the world, you open up that tap, you don't know. Like it could be once or twice a week that it actually flows. And so to do, you know, to cope with that reality that the pipes that are in the ground don't always have water, then people have these backup systems, and that can be a combination of wells and storage tanks. Some people might just have a storage tank so that when the water does come, they can save the water. And other people might actually go and, you know, drill a well, and that gives them the supply. So in that realm of living, you know, where you have the wells and you have the tanks, those are decentralized systems that now are supplying your water. And so I've worked quite a bit with that kind of configuration. It becomes a headache because each individual thing, you know, it's at a customer's location, it needs attention, and then maintenance can fall off. And so for me, it's like a really fascinating thing to think about. How do you coordinate all of that? Like it's a piece. How do you stay on top of it? So, because if you don't stay on top of it, then there's a risk to the consumer. They will run out of water, and then maybe the water quality will suffer. So with that kind of orientation, when you think about the US, you know, although there's a lot of conversation that's happening about aging infrastructure and pipes, we get our water. So potable water wasn't going to be the place where I focused on. But one of the spaces that's really interesting and I think underserved when we think of just the entire water landscape is on the stormwater side. And so, and on stormwater, with stormwater, the infrastructure patterns there start to look a lot like, you know, what the potable water systems look like. And so in particular, you know, for stormwater, you can either, when it rains and water is running off, you can either send it all through like a really big pipe. And, you know, for cities for a long time did that. But over the last 10, 15 years or so, there's been an interest in what's called green stormwater infrastructure. And these are essentially these super soaker sponges that look like, that are engineered systems, but they're decentralized. They can, you know, it's like a small little plot that, you know, well, you already understand something like permeable pavement, for example, that allows more water to infiltrate in. You know, that's green infrastructure. But you can also have things like rain gardens where they're existing, you know, in a median, or you know, it's like a little plot, a little flower plot, and it looks just like pretty flowers. But if you actually moved away the dirt below it, you would see, you know, this engineered system of drains, so that ultimately when it rains, the water is being infiltrated. So
is that because a lot of sorry, not to jump on, but
sure.
In this situation, because we've built roads and cemented everything, we lose places. And Norfolk's a great example where because there's no green anywhere, basically.
Yes.
It's just, it runs off. And then, so we have floods because nothing can soak in. And then, so something like that is the reason why. And I would assume for
exactly, exactly. No, you've nailed it. So stormwater is a problem when you see flooding. And so to counteract that, having this, you know, green stormwater infrastructure is increasingly thought to be a more sustainable way to deal with that water that's running off instead of sending it through that big pipe, because that big pipe that you might have done previously is really expensive. And then you'd have to just, for what it takes to engineer it and everything else, it's a huge capital expense. And so the idea is that if you can increase your portfolio of green stormwater infrastructure, you can delay and either delay how many of those big pipes you need to build, or even reduce the numbers because you've got just more spots. So you're trying to catch the rain where it comes, and just even rethink what urban design looks like. But my interest in that is that when you talk to and so there's a title when you look at cities, for example, there's a person called a green infrastructure manager, and their whole interest is, well, they're on the design end, and then at some point later, somebody has the job of maintaining these things. When cities are looking about how they balance that portfolio, one of the concerns is that for this green stormwater infrastructure, it's everywhere. It's like a piece here, a piece there. It can become a maintenance nightmare. So I just became very interested in understanding, when you talk to to the folks who are ultimately then responsible for this infrastructure, do they think it's like a pain, and how are they coping with it right now? And might there be some opportunity to get better at that? And, given what their concerns are, because at the end of the day, somebody has to make a decision to even, implement that into the portfolio of strategies for how to manage, the stormwater across a city. And if you're thinking long term and you're thinking, man, I guess it'll be easy enough to build, but who's going to maintain it? Then you've now kind of taken away this more sustainable option off of the table, because you're really uncomfortable about the long-term prospects for having it be maintained and ultimately delivering the value that you were hoping to get in the long term. So to bring it all back though to the initial question that you asked, for all of the background and everything else, I thought, wow, this seems to be an interesting problem. And something that's a little bit familiar, even though, stormwater I've not worked on, hadn't worked on and focused on very much, but it just seemed to be a very interesting space. And so I began an exploration, process, talking to, doing customer discovery and talking to a lot of green infrastructure managers across the East Coast. And then that just led to just a bunch of interesting insights that got us to where we are today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's disturbing to me in a sense when a lot of the proactive work that has been done is throwing the little silver dollar size thing on the store above the storm drain that says "Do not dump storm water leads into the waterways," and that's like, okay, box checked, we're done. And it's just, does anyone even pay attention to that? And it's like,
clearly not.
Yeah, I mean, so it's like we have to take this one step further.
Yeah.
And so is this something that is mandated federally but has to be executed locally?
So the early adopters of green stormwater infrastructure, it tends to be the older cities that have combined sewer overflows. And so, which means that so a combined sewer overflow happens when wastewater and stormwater sometimes can go into the same pipe. And under normal conditions, that kind of works, and it's a economies of scale kind of thing. But then if you've got situations where there's like heavy rain and everything gets overwhelmed, then you can end up with a situation where sewage gets into our waterways. And so there are cities where EPA has said, look, you need to do better at how you're going to handle this whole thing. And so, different cities have, they have a combination of strategies that they enact. And so there are certain cities, for example, on the East Coast, like DC and Philadelphia, for example, that have really gone gung-ho on that. I think in Norfolk, within Hampton Roads, I think there's also a similar consent decree, and they've done similar things to kind of adopt. But I think some of the, I guess, cities that lead in that, and to the extent that there's a federal mandate, it's more driven by that. But I don't think, in terms of it being a requirement, I think only San Francisco might be the only city at the moment that has, specific guidelines about needing to install green stormwater, like that must be included in your approach for how you manage, your stormwater runoff.
So one thing that I've been pondering a lot leading up to this, and I hope that you know the answer to this, because I don't know if it keeps me up at night, but I do think about it often, is that we continue to take water from the aquifer as a fresh water source. And now, as those water levels are starting to decrease, now the idea is, well, we're just going to take the stormwater runoff and we're just going to put it right back in the aquifer. What is being done to filter that water before we put it in this pure form of water? I mean, I really hope that we're smart enough not to just, it will just filter itself out.
No, I mean, typically, like it can vary, but I think the idea with those plans are that there would be some time delay. I don't think it's that yesterday you put it, you push it underground and then tomorrow you're pulling it out. I think in general for those plans, there's some residence time where you do a lot of you do some cleanup, and then ultimately what gets injected or infiltrated in there. I mean, and there's a whole process that happens when you're infiltrating anyway. But I think just spending some time, that underground time, you're flowing through porous material. And then even when you pull it out again, there's probably going to be another treatment process that comes with it. So I think ultimately it's just how do you bank more water to have it, more readily accessible where it's needed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm that makes me feel a little bit better, because it's like sometimes you just have to ask the question because crazier things have happened and be like, oh, well, yeah, we're just dumping it right back in there. So that makes me feel a little.
I mean, and it is a cycle though, right? So even if, I mean, people don't want to think about the fact that like your wastewater goes back into the streams, and then at some point those streams are like, that's what comes in, to get treated.
I don't know if you've heard the short time that you've been here, but when we do get those heavy rains, we get the news coverage saying that this beach is closed and this beach is closed. And, I mean, that's all a direct result of that. And it's really a shame that we have to put public warnings out there to not go into the water, because whatever level is not where it needs to be safe to swim.
Yes.
All right. So I think a lot of people talk about stormwater, flooding, things around water from a negativity standpoint in our area. Sounds like it's a pretty big focus of what you do. Obviously, there's a ton of positives around water as well. Military tourism, I think the ports are all focused around the water. So it's cool that you're kind of challenging and building a business around some of the negative sides around water. Compared to other cities, specifically in the country, where do we stand on how big of an issue is this? Is it super bad? Like, are we ground zero of like patient zero of like, we need to fix this or all hell's going to break loose? Or are we kind of in the middle? Are we nice? Not as bad as we think? Where are we actually in your kind of professional opinion of what you do to fix this problem? How big of an issue is it actually in hashtag the 757 Hampton Roads, Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Chesapeake, Pocosin, Tidewater area? you like that, right? Yeah. I just want to make sure I get all of the and whatever new monikers are coming out too.
Yeah. So actually, let me level set on a couple of things. So with our focus on green stormwater infrastructure and figuring out how can we make it easier to maintain these things, one of the things that came out of that is that if you only have a specialist kind of person who is going to be, who goes to service that infrastructure, then you've limited the pool of who can even work on it. And so in terms of what even came out in our customer discovery sessions, the request or the recurring theme was, I just need this to be something I can put on autopilot. I need this to be easier. I need this to be like a rotor-rooter kind of thing. How can I simplify it? And so that pain point and like addressing that piece, how do I just service these things better so that they work better, so that in the long run there could be less flooding? That led us to thinking about, well, what are the steps for maintaining these structures? And so a couple of the steps, if you bundle it all together, it looks like, oh, I need a specialist guy who knows landscaping, architecture, and all of that to maintain it. But once we started to really get an itemization, we realized, well, you might need, a landscape architect kind of guy to maybe ensure that you have the right set of things that are growing, because you get some infiltration from actually the plants themselves as well. Well, they help with like some of the water quality kinds of things. But when you start to look at the tasks for maintenance and what's involved, then it starts to look like litter removal. It starts to look like weeding, and just a couple of other simple tasks that many people can do. And so a thrust of our strategy. So even though the ultimate, and I'm mentioning that piece because even though the end goal or the bigger picture is that we can have more of these structures that are implemented to help manage, local flooding in our communities. What we've turned out to, I guess, focus a lot on initially is how do we find resources, the workers, to now do these relatively simple tasks like the weeding. And actually, a lot of what we focus right now then is thinking about litter removal. And so in terms of even unexpected kinds of things, I didn't expect to have so much sort of emphasis on that. So I started looking at a water problem, but I ended up now, finding out that, well, to be better at the water thing, finding ways to deploy people to get better at responsive removal of litter as it builds up is one of the really big parts of that. So just for level setting, there's that part of it as well. In terms of maybe you're asking like for flooding and maybe managing that, how does the Hampton Roads area, rank? That's a good question. So I think I think most of the residents of this area have some sense of maybe the dire straits. So ultimately, long term, the strategy that's been embraced is one where we recognize the problem, flooding is an issue, but I think in one of the studies done by the Army Corps of Engineers, it would take Norfolk alone, I think, like more than $1 billion of additional investments if they were going to just do old school engineering away to ensure that no home ever flooded. And so the budget, it doesn't work. And so, well, what do you do when you're aware of the problem, but hey, so like these mitigation strategies, start to come into play. And so, where can we put these pockets of green infrastructure? So it's like all of these, there are a bunch of, what we end up seeing then is a whole ecosystem that's been developed to think about what can be the strategies for how we cope with not being able to just, snap a finger and engineer it all the way tomorrow. And I think like many other, I guess, low-lying cities, the coping strategies are similar.
Because it's New Orleans at 8 feet under, and then our area,
right?
I think.
Yeah, I think
we're below sea level too.
Number two, I think maybe is the ranking or something.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like for what in terms of the ecosystem though that's tackling this, elsewhere. One of the things I think that's been encouraging is there's this whole innovation ecosystem that it has spawned, right? There's like a flood management innovation ecosystem. So there's groups like Rise and a couple of others who are sort of this launch pad for companies that are working on, how to sort of tackle this overall flooding issue that we're having.
And they're big friends with some groups out of the Netherlands, I believe, and if I recall, something like that. And like they partner because they did some stuff. I don't know. I feel like
you mean the city? If the city partnered with the Netherlands?
Yeah, the Netherlands or Rise. I feel like they've done something because they have a similar area to us.
No, I think you're correct, and I don't know. There have been several projects, and I don't know where it is where those projects stand at the moment. But I do think the ecosystem has been such that it's meant to create this what do you call it, inclusive environment, where if you are sharing that similar challenge and you've maybe solved, or you have some great ideas about how to solve that and you've demonstrated it elsewhere, there's an opening to try it here too.
What has been, based on your findings, what's the biggest contributor to the litter? Is it like roadside litter? Is it just through urban areas? Where are you seeing the biggest?
And I think that's a really great question. So I think one of the things that has struck us so far is that the old school ways of dealing, I think we have probably more litter than ever, and we need more solutions than ever to come to the table. For the sources, I think a lot of people talk about single-use plastics and your Amazon packages. And so I think there's a parallel where as we grow, we are increasingly the convenience economy, right? We want it fast, we want it now, we want it simple. But the trade-off, the more convenience that we're getting, then somebody's absorbing that, and that just tends to happen in our on our roadsides and in our parks. I think the biggest contributors, I think they just vary a lot by location. Human activity is a really huge driver, and so that human activity can manifest in different ways depending on what the situation is. And so, for example, one of the places, in Norfolk, we're doing pilots in parks, for example. And so when you think about the parks that really struggle with litter, some of that happens because, their different communities use parks in different ways. So I think many people are accustomed to a park being a place where maybe you do a light jog and then you go home, or there's a quick picnic, But there are some communities, and especially some of the lower income communities, parks become more of a refuge, right? It's a place where I barely have like a lot of, outdoorsy space where I live. So when I go to the park, it's almost like, on the weekends, it's like a gathering of my friends. It's like a Super Bowl party. Like it's a whole festival, entirely different from maybe the more, I don't know, lighter human activity uses. And so in those cases, if you come to that thinking, oh, I can just send a volunteer like once a month and maybe that'll do it, then all of these unexpected things happen. And sometimes it's not just that, oh, the people who came there were intending to trash the place. Maybe some of that does happen. But if you think, the analogy that I always think about is that if you've ever had at your house a whole bunch of people, maybe even more than there should be, who come there and hang out, even if you've got the bags and everybody's trying to put things away, you still end up with some cups that are out there. Like somebody still has to come and clean up afterwards. So anyways, we see things like that where just different neighborhoods have different intensities of use, and so that just is one thing that changes the whole thing. On road segments, what's been very interesting is that you start to see patterns of that are connected to, it's still, that human activity, but that human activity is connected to how a particular space is being used. In one of the in one of the cities that where we have work on roadsides, there start to be very huge differences, between like the road segments connected to a vineyard versus the road segments connected to where contractors are working. And so, you find that, well, for the vineyards, they somehow, with the activity, and probably they also have their folks who are actively going out and removing any litter, it tends to be not a lot of buildup of bottles or anything like that. But invariably on road segments, whenever there's heavy machinery, whether it's tractors or where construction is happening, those road segments tend to be ones where lots of bottles, cans, wrappers from the construction activity. So anyway, so there are things like that you start to notice that it's more location based on what's happening with the human activity. And some of those things start to come back to when you think about the stormwater infrastructure and what ends up going downstream. It's one thing, by the time that you've gotten downstream, there are just different things that are happening at the top that are contributing to that. So over the long term, what I'm excited about is that, because we're beginning to tease out a lot of these patterns, for us to be good at what we do, understanding the patterns and figuring out what strategies to deploy workers is a really important piece. But we want to be able to work with other groups who are trying to figure out, oh my gosh, for the Chesapeake Bay or for the others that we're trying to do better with, how can we get better at understanding what's going on upstream so that we can more effectively engage? And if effectively engaging doesn't just mean that, you tell businesses to be better or tell people or educate people not to throw the things out, but do you have the right set of strategies in your toolbox, to help improve the situation? And sometimes we think that means that for the kind of paid service that we offer, where either on demand or with a recurring kind of use, you use Frontline as the approach to really get things back up to a level where it now becomes more manageable and no longer a threat to downstream when you've got a heavy rain that occurs.
Well, it's really interesting. Taking a walk several weekends ago, we went to Yorktown Beach, and my wife and I, we commented. It was awesome. I mean, just in the sense of, just like you had described, there were so many people. Everybody, I mean, there's just multiple families that were there. They're playing music, and it was such a diverse. There's so much diversity. I mean, like, I didn't know that there was that much diversity in the York County area. But I mean, so there was all kinds of different music. There was all kinds of different food. I mean, and the place was just packed. And then, to your point, I'm just thinking to myself, my gosh, there's all this going on, and they're producing a lot of garbage. And that York County is on the hook to continue to collect all of this trash to the point where it's like, I can't even, it would take multiple people over the course of the weekend nonstop collecting trash, that it's like, wow, this is like a lost leader for York County, that just to stay on top of all the trash that's being produced. So I definitely see what you're saying there. And my other point to what you were saying, I'm sure that Elon Musk is listening to this. But one thing that I would really like him to do and is established a contract with you, because the one thing that's missing at all of the supercharging stations around the world, there's not a single garbage can at the superchargers. I mean, and it's just like, and I get it. There's no one staffs these superchargers, because you go there, you plug in, and hit your card, and it's completely seamless. But there's no garbage receptacle there at all. And I wish that would be something that he would add.
Have you seen that as does that tend to be
everywhere, everyone?
Like a lot of just a litter attractant? Like it's a place where trash does build up?
Some are worse than others. And sometimes, I mean, it would really bother me. It's just like, come on, people. I mean, it's like, you're at a Tesla supercharger.
Interesting.
Clearly, the only people that are creating this litter are people in Teslas. So it's just like, stop. You're making
I mean, there's a
everyone
lot of
look
people
really
at
bad.
there's a lot of people at your standard gas station that seem to litter too. At least, I guess, hopefully there's someone there to clean it up. But I mean,
Yeah.
they don't want that trash in their car, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting though. I hadn't thought of.
If you ever check out a supercharger, look, you won't ever find a trash can.
So the one in the city of Norfolk parking garage, there's not a trash can around that?
Well, that's not a supercharger. That's a destination charger. So the superchargers, that's something that Tesla puts in and maintains.
Gotcha. How do you make this a business? How did you figure out the revenue model, the business model to make this so that you can live off of?
Yeah, so I think it's back to, well, the idea that, with the green stormwater infrastructure as the inspiration, it turns out that when you now start to engage cities more broadly to talk about this, there are a couple of pain points that they have. One of the things that's been really interesting to tease out is that there's a labor challenge that cities are facing. So, that national conversation about everybody quitting and people rethinking their lives, it's happening at every level. And so what's interesting about something like, so there are these kinds of tasks at cities, right? Whether it's, like the litter pickup is different from the trash pickup, right? Because that's more like the standard waste management system, that works, and we're ancillary to that. But so for the piece of, and back to the pieces of the job, so there's like the weeding and the other things that I haven't really even talked about. We're just focused right now on just optimizing our model for the litter. But so the first realization was that one, litter is a problem for green stormwater infrastructure. It impairs its function, but it's also this issue more broadly that cities are having to deal with, right? Whether it's on roadsides or in parks. So that was sort of the first thing. It's like, oh, wait a minute, right? Like this litter in and of itself, whether it's on the, whether it's directly in the path of stormwater or not, cities are having to just figure out what to do about it just because of how our economy and our consumption habits are changing. But then the question is, well, who does it? Like, who does the litter piece? Like, who picks that up? And so, that tends to be an in-house kind of thing where they try to fit it in. And so for some cities, there's not really one litter person. You try to kind of have some education function, but there's not like, even though it's a big thing, it's kind of, it's a tricky thing because cities, they do get concerned sometimes about, if they directly are seen to pay for it, it might mean that they're incentivizing bad behavior. But I think we have, been able to prove out with some of our work so far that that's not really the dynamic. So for the business model, then, what we end up doing is that we charge for, there's a service piece of it where we're ensuring that there's a constant workforce that's available to do this litter removal. And these are gig workers. And so one of the ways that we're able to now help the city with its labor shortage is that the people who are working to do a litter pickup, we are changing how that job works. So you're not outside, at a job site for 8 hours a day, because that's the problematic piece. Having people fill those roles where they've got to commit themselves to do this one task for like 8 hours a day at a relatively low wage if it's full time, it's becoming an increasingly difficult value prop for that kind of worker. So we chunk the job, we make it smaller. So we keep the actual commitment, down to an hour or two, and we pay, decently well. So similar to an Uber or any of the other gig companies, to go and pick litter, you make comparable or better wages depending on how fast you work. And for the city, then the value is that we are reducing customer complaints, and we're helping you reprioritize how you use the existing labor that you have. There are other folks, the folks that they have, there's a lot that the city does for residents. And so for this piece where a responsive entity is required, we're filling that gap and helping to control what it costs, even though, because the workers are not our full-time employees, then, we recoup some of the efficiencies that way. But this idea then of how to staff, blue collar labor, that also is just becoming an increasingly tricky kind of value prop, because everybody's rethinking, who's going to monopolize and control my time? How do I spend my time? How am I spending my day? Why do I not have control of that? And so we are, looking to respond to that market as well. And I think, so for the workers that we're tapping into, there are different motivations for why they'd be interested to join a gig. But I think part of it as well is that, for how the world has shifted, it's a very interesting time, that we're in. And so that's also a piece of just the excitement of what we have, for what's next.
How can the residents, what did you call it, Zach? Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Chesapeake, Poquoson,
Tidewater, Hampton Roads, 757.
How can the residents of this community, how can they support you? Or how can they make an impact for the environment?
Well, I mean, one, I'd love to get more gig workers who want to join us. So that's one thing.
And they go to your website for that?
Yes. And also on the other side, if there are, whether it's other governments or I guess even private businesses, events, kinds of entities, universities that need some help with how they're managing litter removal or similar, sort of simple green space maintenance tasks, we'd love to be a partner with them.
Zach?
A little slow today, apparently. What's something we haven't talked about that you want to talk about?
No, I think you did a really good job.
I mean, I think that it's fascinating in the sense of when you look at one area, and then as you continue to the cliche, peel the onion back, how you get to where we are today, that trash has produces much more of a challenge than one would think.
Yeah, I mean, again, I never, well, for where we are now, I never expected to be so immersed into focusing on trash and litter.
Right.
But it's just an interesting opportunity space that gets us optimizing this idea of these relatively simple jobs that are available at cities, and if we can figure that one out, then, I'm already having these other conversations where, other contractors are like, oh man, we need that too. That labor thing? Oh my, if you can just help us,
So once you conquer trash, because I think that another thing that is really, really needed is the fact that we engineered plastic to be too good. It lasts way too long and it does not biodegrade quick enough. So as solutions arise to be more biodegradable, and once you conquer the litter problem, where do you see your next challenge being?
So for the machinery that we're deploying, so litter is one of the aims is to ensure that everybody has access to clean green space, right? So green space, the green stormwater infrastructure is one example of a green space, but it's broader than that. And so with that aim of that clean green space, then you can start to think of the other simple tasks that need to be addressed, right? So there's a path where after you focus on optimizing how you deploy people to do litter and do that well, then moving into weeding and some of the other maintenance tasks that are relatively simple, that's one of the growth trajectories. There's another piece where for the software that we're building out to do this and helping people understand to deploy maintenance for these jobs that tended to have somebody working full time doing that to do one job or something that's really, really tedious. How do you chunk it up? How do you split it? And so the software side of things, the idea, to have the other path is that we are optimizing what that looks like as well. And so, so next year, this time, for what that looks like, I think if for what I see, we would have made progress on both of those fronts. Having more use cases where we've, made more blue collar jobs into sweet gigs, that are like flexible, and then really showing that, we've been able to give more communities, increased clean green space, and all of it to the benefit of cities who are able to just better optimize their spend.
And if you ever need another idea, I'm sure Tim can tell you just through his adventures in his Tesla, because apparently he wants plastic bottles to go away and he wants trash cans at more supercharger stations. So I'm sure there's another one out there. Kala, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you today. And look, I'm telling you, if you ever need an idea, just go talk to at Ryan TNT on Twitter, because apparently he's just full of them. So
I care about the environment. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. This has been amazing.
Awesome. We'll chat soon. Thanks for being with us.